And a couple of the things that I'll maybe talk about here relate to this class, and I teach about creative practices, which is a sophomore level class. A few of the conclusions kind of come from that. The book actually came, after pitching this class. The class I pitched to the art department several years ago in reaction to a lot of the stuff we were talking about earlier, about students coming in and not having, being very sort of upset with the idea of ambiguity in a project. It used to be, it's like, come up with something interesting, and suddenly, within about 2 years, it was like, well, what do you mean? What's interesting? Who defines that? What's your rubric? It's like, rubric? What are you talking about? So the ground definitely shifted under us in terms of, who our students were and how they were being taught. So I did a lot of research on this and came up with a class, and one of the things that I realized was that I hadn't come across anybody that had done a systematic study of these mid-career artists related to this idea of long-term sustainability, which I felt was my goal. Most of the time, I think, when we talk about creativity in the video, I think is a really good example of some of that. Most creativity, as it's approached in science and business and industry and art, is really short-term problem solving. Which is, you get a problem, very clear parameters. We have, the school needs innovation because we have problems. We have this sort of widget that we're trying to make that we can't make for some reason. It's like a very clear problem. And that is, in a lot of creativity literature, that gets sort of extrapolated out into a long stretch of time. They just sort of assume if you do that for a longer period of time, then you're creative. And I didn't agree with that, and so I started asking artists specifically about that. And so a lot of what I am finding that I'm focusing on more would be something that I might define as long-term creative sustainability. And, like how do people sort of do this over a long time? So I started interviewing these artists, and I find these folks, they're mid-career, they're successful, they either have critical or professional success, commercial success of some type. A lot of them are academics, just because that's what happens in the arts. But a lot of them are not. They have 10 years of unbroken making behind them. So, they're out of school, they kind of work through all the school stuff, and they're out, and they're kind of intuitively doing this on their own. One of the things that, we've talked, a couple of you sort of mentioned the idea of there being different types of creativity, which is obviously borne out in a lot of this literature and information. There's, sort of craftsman-like creativity, people that can actually be very good fabricating things, curatorial creativity, connected, I think maybe it's what you were mentioning. And actually, that was a very interesting point, because one of the things that I found is that I don't think that artists really do that thing. I think that almost all the productivity from the artists that I've seen is actually connected in nature. But what they're doing is that they are going back and reconnecting with previous works. And so it's not really ex nihilo at all. They're always going into the studio. And one of the big points of kind of discovery that I'm finding is that all of these artists intuitively develop strategies to position what they're doing to be moving forward and be very expansive. So when they go into the studio, they don't get stuck because they got this and this and this and this that they did 2 years ago that they want to work on again. And so this woman that I was talking with this morning is a great example of that. She had this show, and this show is all kind of about threats and disasters and the apocalypse and all of this kind of very dark stuff. And so she's making prints, she's making these little sculptures, she's making these pinhole camera photographs, she's making videos based on this. They're all sort of about these central ideas, but they're coming at it from very different points of view. And even those works were actually kind of referencing previous works that she's done. And so a lot of artists kind of leave these rabbit trails for themselves. So they'll make a work and then just sort of put it aside, come back to it kind of years later, sometimes decades later, and sort of reinterpret, reevaluate, put it into a new media, translate it into a new media. And so I would say almost all of this stuff is connective. There's also a value to creativity and something that would be maybe what you were talking about, is more generative, sort of the ex nihilo, like the light bulb, the inspiration, that kind of stuff. And I don't really see, like, between all these different types of creativity that are pretty standard and well documented out there, I don't really see a lot of distinction between, like, how artists approach. Artists use all these as the same as scientists and engineers and all this. I don't see a really big difference in that. I do see a difference in how artists I think artists frequently use multiple forms of these different types of creativity simultaneously, and I think that that's perhaps different. But it's like connective creativity is connective creativity. It's like it doesn't really matter if it's artwork or if it's science or business or industry or whatever. It's all really similar, I think. So that was in thinking about a lot of this stuff. Talked to this group of people. Let's make sure I got my notes. Okay, I talked about that. It's sort of curious to bring up like this study in a group like this. I'm not really sure exactly how scalable some of this stuff is, but I think some of it is. So anyway, the one thing I talked about already is a very big thing, that the studio is really defined by time rather than space and production. And so when I say studio, to non-artists, they tend to think of like space. When I say studio to the artists that I'm talking about, well, this is a studio for a lot of them. So I get to do a lot of my work on a computer. It's like, well, tell me about your studio time. It's like, what do you do? It's like, well, I spend a lot of it on computers. Okay, and so for them, that's a certain kind of focusing experience. They tend to have multiple spaces that support multiple different kinds of activities, which is very common, 2 or 3 spaces out there. Research model that rather than a production model, as I mentioned earlier. I would say, curious, I actually asked people like how much time they spend working in the studio. It's like, well, how much is that? And I was actually pretty surprised about this number. It's about 20 hours. It's actually very typical. Like an actual production, what they're doing, days per week. Most typically, I'd say that's like 4 hours a day, 5 days a week, 6 hours a day, 3.5 days a week or so. That's roughly how that shakes out. But there's this other curious thing that kind of happens simultaneously because, 20 hours a week sounds like, wow, it seems like a job that I would like to have. It's like half time. There's this other thing that kind of happens simultaneously in that when we talk about other kind of support activities that people are doing, like what do you do that kind of supports that in terms of gathering information? I find that artists tend to be very big readers. Statistically so far, and what I found is that more than 60% of the people that I've interviewed are reading more than 3 or more types of genres of everything from sort of a standard to read criticism. You have to read some of that just to be current, but like the woman that I was interviewing this morning, she said, I read novels. I read trashy novels, and I read good novels. It's like, okay. Oh, and by the way, I also read scientific literature. Oh, and by the way, I also read criticism, and I also read this other stuff, too. And that's actually very common, to the point where, you think about 20 hours a week. When I start to ask them, well, how much reading, time does this actually take? Or like collecting, artists are sort of notorious for amassing information. They don't typically sort of suggest that is related to studio time. Studio time tends to be like fabrication and tinkering, but it's not sort of information gathering. All of these other, like just the reading part of, kind of the support activity is actually very seldom is it less than 20% of the time that they're spending in the studio. So if they're working in the studio 10 hours a week, that means that outside of the studio, which is, nobody does that, but like in proportion it would be 2 hours a week outside. So if it's 20 hours a week in the studio, that's 4 to 6 hours. And I would say that's on the low end. I don't really find anybody that's investing less than 20% of their time in these support activities. And it's actually not unusual to find people that are spending 100% of that time. So if they're working in the studio 20 hours a week, they're working outside of the studio, reading, collecting information up to 20 hours a week also. So it's a huge support thing that they have going. And some of that is just, like writing proposals, but a lot of it is not. A lot of it is really, sort of feeding the beast, so to speak. A curious thing about the reading that I found also is that, and this maybe relates a bit more to what you were talking about, Jay, is that the principal areas of reading are not directly related to what they're doing. And so, an example, I was interviewing a printmaker the other day, and he makes these large, gorgeous, super saturated black, very lush kind of landscape prints that are very big. I said, well, tell me about your readings. Well, he was he was Japanese, and so tend to be very modest. And so it's like, tell me about your reading. So I don't really read that much. Well, tell me about that. I read the newspaper. It's like, well, tell me about like what that looks like for you. I said, well, like the last bit of the way that I tend to read the newspaper is, I'm sort of quoting him roughly. He says, like the tsunami in Japan that happened recently. I was very curious about that. So this is one of the ways that I tend to read. So I read that from the American press. Then I went to Fox News, and I sort of read it according to Fox News, and then I went to the Russian press, and I read like everything that they had to say about it. I went to the Chinese press, and everything they had to say about it. I went to the Japanese press. So you just read the newspaper? Yeah, that's all I do. It's very funny, but it's what that has to do actually with his. The actual work is, it's a pretty thin story. It's really not a one-to-one relationship here, but it's about understanding different kinds of capacities, I think. I've yet to kind of sort that out, and I don't know that I ever will, to be honest with you. But I think it's really interesting that generally the type of reading that they're doing, the type of information gathering that they're doing, that they principally invest in, is actually very seldom directly related to what they're doing. It's sort of a funny stretch that way.
Makes me feel better than about all the weird stuff I do.
Yeah.
Good, thank you.
Yeah, okay. I'm glad I could help. So, let's see. Here's another interesting thing that I found about in terms of experimentation and working through different media. There is a sort of a small group of artists, like when you say, like, what is your degree in? They'll say, printmaking, painting, sculpture, like whatever. And how many media have you worked in your career? The media would be like printmaking, painting, sculpture. A very small group, like maybe 15, 20%, probably closer to 15%, will have worked like with one media their whole life. Like that's it. I'm a painter. End of story. The rest average more than 5 media in their career, and so they're constantly shifting around, constantly doing things. And this is not just economically driven. And sometimes it's to their detriment, and it's actually not really about. There's a lot of cliches about artists, but keep in mind that the artists that I'm talking about are really professionally accomplished. These are people that are very self-disciplined, and so these are not folks that are wandering because they're bored. These are folks that are sort of constantly using new media to challenge their ideas and reinvent their ideas. Maybe related to some of the things we were talking about earlier. Going back and rather than, always, it would look like moving from one media to the next might feel like you're actually jumping ship and changing it, but actually the ideas are the same. What they're doing is they're kind of doing what you're doing with your lectures, and they're finding ways to strategize and get at some of the ideas in a deeper way. That's actually kind of what's going on there. And the last thing, just keeping this within the time frame, I have a lot more stuff, but these are the bigger ones. Like I said, one of the things that the artists tend to do as they are, producing various bodies of work is that they tend to create inertia in the works that pull them forward. So they never walk into the studio with nothing to do. That never happens. So occasionally they just hit a wall. I've got a woman that I'm interviewing next week who said, I'm just dying to interview her because she says that she's currently divorcing her muse. So I'm very curious what this means exactly. So, but they will do things like reinvent what they're doing. And I find that, what I have kind of come to believe about all of these activities that they do is that they tend to become very keen managers of their own emotions and their own motivations. And so it's not just that they are doing these things to kind of position it forward, but they kind of know what gets them going. They know the kind of things that will work for them, and they blow up their process at specific times in order to facilitate these really interesting collisions and explosions, you could say. So that's a little bit of it. So.
Yeah, that's good. And Ken spoke in I think it was prime. I think it was a prime time one. Mm-hmm. So there's a tape of that if you want to hear kind of a longer version of it than last spring he did. I was thinking this is going to change directions a little bit of what we were thinking maybe, but we don't have a ton of time, and I want to respect the time too. But I'd like to maybe just have us think a little bit about connections between what we were saying before Ken talked and kind of what Ken was just saying now, connections we see maybe between what we do and what he's talking about, or connections we see that other people maybe are making. So maybe just go a little bit with that direction. And also just to say real quick too that this looking at creativity, this whole PLC thing is not going to be just focused on creativity, which would probably bore the heck out of you.
No, it would be good, yeah.
You know, I think it's helpful to look at creativity as a whole, get a feel for how it happens, and think about how it translates into our teaching, obviously, what happens at Bethel. Because I think there's tons of principles that relate directly to what we do, and we're going to start making more and more of those connections. But I don't know, what resonated with what he was saying here? What connections do you see between what we've said or what you said initially? And Ken, I'm curious your thoughts too. And you alluded to a number of as you were going here. But
I can tell you, one of the things that came directly out of this, and I'll just share this briefly, I've been talking a lot, but one of the things that came out of this in my creative practices class, this is a sophomore level class, is that I have really changed the nature of that class to not be, it's really a time-based thing. So now students, they have to work 5 days a week. There's a major requirement, 60% of the grade, so they have to work 5 days a week. They work for between 45 minutes and 90 minutes a day. On non-objective criteria. So they have to develop a plan for themselves, like what are you going to do, which includes media direction, some reading that they have to do, and so on. But they go into the studio. I don't allow them to work more than 1 day on any project. So literally is that a class is forcing them to experiment day after day after day after day. And that's, it takes them about 2 weeks to actually believe me when I tell them that, you know, it's like really, you just make what you want to make. You know, it's like, and they bring it every week. They show their peers. I don't get in there, because if I get in there, especially at the beginning, then suddenly it's a critique again, and they're back into this whole pattern. But the big takeaway from this stuff into that class is creating a very different relationship to their work, which I think has actually been pretty successful. So they get out of this habit of making work for me, making work for the assignment, making work for faculty, and they start to really own it. So, and the other thing that I would say that we do in that class that is really helpful is actually talk about a lot of the stuff that you two were bringing up, like all of the way that education shapes us. And we actually talk about that quite a lot in the class.
I think one thing that resonated with me is when you were talking about, you know, how we leave rabbit trails. You know, we leave rabbit trails of creativity, and I thought that really goes along with our scholarly agenda. You know, when you talk about a scholarly agenda, you have different things that we're interested in, and the whole point of a scholarly agenda is you start with something, and then all of a sudden you have a tentacle here, and then you have something over here, and oh wow, I learned something there, and now I'm going over here. And so I think that anybody that has an active scholarly agenda is really being creative. That's an ongoing process.